live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists. This is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
Well, there's no shortage of tropical activity to talk about this week with two active named storms, not one, but two recent United States landfalls, two tropical waves that could develop, and something to possibly keep an eye on in the Caribbean for next week. As always, thanks for joining us on today's edition of Tracking the Tropics. I'm your host, meteorologist Amanda Hawley, here in the Stream Center, joined by WFLA meteorologist Rebecca Berry. And we also have our featured meteorologist this week, Tim Miller. He is the chief meteorologist at WJBF in Augusta, Georgia. Thanks for joining us this week, Tim.
Hey, Amanda, Rebecca, it's great to be here.
So yeah, we definitely have a lot to talk about. I'm going to send it right on over to Rebecca to kind of break down an overview of what we're looking at here. And then we're going to also be talking about what we might be watching heading into the middle of next week. You can take it away, Rebecca.
Man, the tropics turned on like a light switch. We went from nothing to talk about. We were getting really nitty gritty talking on Tracking the Tropics the last couple of weeks since we didn't have any tropical activity to track. That's when you get those super nerdy Tracking the Tropics shows where we're talking about wind shear versus sea surface temperatures. Well, now we have a whole lot to talk about, so let's talk about it. And so, Harold, we talked about how that system that brought enhanced rain chances to the Florida Peninsula over the weekend, it hadn't formed yet. They were just slow-moving tropical downpours on Sunday. Once it got closer to the Texas coastline, it was expected to develop, and it did. It briefly formed tropical storm force status before making its way on shore on the Texas-Mexico line right there. It's been a little bit of a drought buster for them. You know, we've had the big heat dome across parts of northern Texas, and they didn't get enough rain to help with that heat dome or with any of that system because the heat dome was actually steering, Harold, because air goes clockwise around a high pressure system, and so the high pressure is about right here, and so that steered Harold onshore just a little bit further south than that. But they still needed rain in Mexico. They still needed rain in the parts of Texas that got the rain, and it wasn't too bad. I think 50-mile-per-hour sustained winds is the worst that we saw. Now, Tropical Storm Franklin is the only one I'm worried about on the map today. Tropical Storm Franklin is bringing life-threatening flooding rainfall to Hispaniola. We're talking mudslides, we're talking about power outages, and so Hispaniola gets hit more frequently than most areas do, but unfortunately, this rainmaker is really going to be a problem for them. It's been raining over Hispaniola from Franklin since yesterday, and Franklin's only about halfway through moving over that island. Now we have the other areas to watch, the problems that aren't yet problems, if you will. Emily briefly spun up and then briefly dissipated, and now here's the remnants of Emily, and there's a 70% chance for that to develop. And then looking a little bit further south, this is 92L. There's a 30% chance for it to develop. But look at the positionings, especially the remnants of Emily, much further north in the Atlantic than we normally see. So if you've been with us on the past episodes this season, we've talked a lot about how the wind shear over the mid-Atlantic that sets up because of El Nino might cause a lot of storms to form just north of that, out of the areas of wind shear. And in that case, we would end up with more fish storms than usual this season, the storms that form out in the Atlantic and stay out in the Atlantic. And that's certainly the case with what's left over of Emily. And it was mostly the case for Gert. Gert was a very short-lived system that is now dissipated. It brought some rain to the Windward and Leeward Islands, but that was about it. And so we're keeping an eye on all the development, but nothing headed towards the continental U.S. from this point forward. Even once Franklin does make it out into the open Atlantic, we're looking at more of a potential for it to just stay in the Atlantic. And so these are the remnants of Harold. And so not a lot. A lot of times with weaker tropical systems like weak tropical storms, we do worry a lot about inland flooding because because it's such a weak system, there's no strong center of rotation to evenly distribute the rain around that storm. So a lot of times the weaker storms are more lopsided with a big area of convection, an area of rain that can stall out over a certain area and cause some inland flooding. The good news is that's not what we're seeing with Harold. I think the atmosphere is so dry there that it's really just eating away at anything that Harold could continue to drop in terms of rainfall. And when you look at the rainfall from Harold, it's quite compact. Now, there are some hot spots in that 2 to 3 inch range, but it's pretty confined. Most areas from Harold just saw that ½ inch to an inch of rain. Beneficial rainfall, but not flooding rainfall, which is good news for Texas. As far as what we're looking at with Franklin, now Tropical Storm Franklin is expected to continue to make its way over Hispaniola, and you can see this one does have pretty evenly distributed rain. Now it's a little heavier on the south and on the east side than it is on the west side, but we are looking at it continuing to move. Right now, it's moving to the north at 13 miles per hour. And in tropical storm world, that's pretty fast. So that's good news. The maximum winds are only 40 miles per hour and the minimum central pressure is at 1,004 millibars. Here's what we expect out of Tropical Storm Harold after this, making some really odd meandering moves before becoming a Category 1 hurricane by the time Friday morning rolls around, possibly a Category 2 hurricane by Monday morning with 105 mile per hour sustained winds. But it is pretty far to the north. I think at this point it would be getting caught up in the upper level winds that may push it away out into the upper Atlantic. But that's just something we'll have to keep an eye on. But all in all, I'm not really worried about Franklin once it gets over Hispaniola and once the flooding recedes from the rainfall in Hispaniola. I think that's going to be the main impact from Harold. Now we've got what's left over of Emily and 92L. Since they're not formed, we don't have tracks for them, but we do have spaghetti forecast models. And so 92L taking a very similar motion to what Emily did, putting it in a basically similar position as the remnants of Emily right now, which are expected to travel due north into the open Atlantic. So I'm thinking that both of these will end up being fish storms and nothing to really worry about for us. And that is what we talked about earlier this season as a big possibility because of the stronger layers of shear. Now, let's talk about rain because there is a lot of tropical moisture headed towards the southeast. We are very dry right now, and we've been quite dry all summer long, but a system exits the Yucatan. It tries to form. It really does, but there's just not enough elements there that work in its favor. And so instead of getting a tropical system headed our way, we're just going to get a surge of that much needed beneficial tropical moisture, enhancing our rain chances. We're talking slow moving downpours. We're talking about decent rainfall accumulations. We're talking about getting rain over a significant period of time, not just all at once like we do with our summertime thunderstorms. And so by the middle to end of next week, Florida in particular will be looking at very good chances for rain, and even into coastal Georgia there, all the way up to Augusta, even into the Carolinas, the coastal areas there, that moisture is headed your way eventually. There's not a lot working against it to force it back further south immediately. And so we're thinking Wednesday, Thursday, really good coverage of much needed rain. And that's really what we could use this time of the year because we have been so dry. We haven't seen any good chances for rain in the forecast for the next couple of days, but we sure could use some tropical moisture, especially if it comes without all the winds and without all the storm surge. We like weak tropical systems this time of the year, especially when they don't even have enough strength to become an actual system.
Absolutely. I mean, we have been so dry, and yeah, we're going to get a couple showers today and tomorrow, Rebecca, but this weekend, I mean, even drier. It's pretty weird for us to be heading into August with this little of rainfall that we have. You're shaking your head there, Tim. Is that a similar setup for you guys?
Well, yeah. Well, actually, we've had a lot of rain. I'm really surprised because, you're talking about that. This is the rainy season down in Tampa Bay, right? I mean, this is where you guys get all the rain. You get these summer storms that can very easily produce, 2-3 inches of rain a day, depending upon these storms. But y'all been pretty dry. We've been fairly lucky. We're in this dry pattern now because the high pressure that's actually Hillary, that was off into California, moved that dome of high pressure that's been causing all the western heat more towards the east. And that's warmed us up significantly over the last few days. But luckily, we've had these little cold fronts that come through. I mean, August cold front for us, we go from 98 to 92, right? But what it's done is brought in drier air, which is what's happened today. But yeah, normally we get our summer storms as well. Not as many as y'all get, but still, yeah, you guys have been well below where you need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still warm there, but at least you guys are getting that break in the humidity from these little fronts that have come through. They don't make it here. For us, we've just been dealing with an extremely humid southwest wind off the 90-degree Gulf of Mexico waters. So it's been really humid here, a drier pattern than normal. And yes, so we could use the rain. Again, we could be looking at that heading into the middle of next week. There's, some grumblings about it on social media. Some of those forecast models, they try and develop it here and there. They keep it weak. But of course, we're keeping an eye on it. There's that tropical moisture. We talk about this, yearly, Tim, with the Central American gyre down near Central America, the Yucatan Peninsula. And sometimes those can spin up little weak systems. But with this right now, it really just looks like we're looking at some tropical moisture headed our way.
Yeah, I tell you, one of the most interesting things I think so far this year is how quiet it's been up until recently. And you got to think about this. You're talking, May, June, July, now August. So that sun has been baking the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic and the Caribbean. So it's sort of like, I mean, it's ripe. It's like if I use the analogy, I try to use food analogies because it's, I love to eat, right? So the food analogy would be, it's like having a brisket that you have in a Weber grill, right? And it's just baking, right? Just nothing's happening to it. You just leave it in the grill. That's exactly what the Gulf of Mexico water's been like, and the Atlantic. So I mean, you're talking about water that's ripe for the picking. For even the smallest storm that could really get going here, certainly has the juice to be able to do that and move quickly and develop quickly.
Yeah, and it doesn't take much time. I mean, we saw over the past 48, 72 hours, we increased our storm name list by 3 or 4 here. So we're now up to 8 total named storms, not including the unnamed storm there in January, which is, decent news because the one that impacted at least the Gulf Coast here was Harold. Of course, we had Hillary in California, which is a different H name because if you've been following along on Tracking the Tropics here over the past few years, you know that the Atlantic and the Pacific have different name lists because they're different basins. But for the Gulf of Mexico, we had the Harold H name that made landfall there in Texas. But yeah, we kind of checked off those names rapidly over the past 72 hours, with the next name on the list being Idalia. And it doesn't take much if it moves into the Gulf of Mexico, as we just saw with Harold.
Yeah, we were talking about some of the Gulf water temperature, and there was a report just a couple of weeks ago that the waters, was it off Sarasota? Y'all know better than I do. Was 100 or near 100?
That was down in the Keys.
Down in the Keys? Yeah, that's a crazy number. I don't know about y'all, but I've never heard of 100-degree temperature water.
I mean, it's really difficult for water in general to heat up. We don't see the temperature fluctuations of water like we do air. So it's insanely hard to get water up to that temperature with just the sun. It was in an area of darker water, which does help, but still, we're talking about 101 degree temperature there. That was pretty astonishing to all of us here as well.
That's right. I won't get into the pool here unless it's 90 degrees. And
right.
It takes a long time for that to happen. So if it's below 90, forget it.
Yeah.
I mean, so I totally understand these storms and all, and how that, they need that warmer water. Man, they sure have it now.
Yeah, and Rebecca, I mean, you and I are familiar with, those warm waters too. We like it warm as well, but I mean, 100 degrees is even too warm for us.
That's a little too warm. And I did want to point out one thing that you pointed out last week, Amanda, when we were talking about the possibility of Harold forming in the Gulf, is that it might help with the sea surface temperatures a little. And if you look at this updated map right there along the Texas coastline, it does look like it cooled the sea surface temperatures in a very small area of the Gulf. But we talked about the benefits of a weaker system, rainfall, of course, maybe a drought buster, and also calming things down a little bit in the Gulf. I would have liked to have seen more of that. Yeah. That would have been nicer, but we are seeing a tiny bit right there along the Texas coastline on this map.
Yeah, hey, it crossed over the tropical wave at this point. It crossed over our state in Florida on Sunday, and then sat in the Gulf of Mexico for a couple of days moving. But hey, we will take what we can get at this point. Of course, Tracking the Tropics is interactive here, and we do take your questions. We can answer them live in real time. You can see the hashtags there on your screen. You can use hashtag Hey Amanda to ask a question, hashtag Hey Rebecca, and hashtag Hey Tim as well. We have this first featured comment coming in from Kathy on the WKRG Facebook page asking, will this weather affect flights to Florida Thursday and Friday? I'm assuming of next week here, Kathy. Rebecca, I'll send it to you. We've just started to unfold this tropical moisture making its way toward the southeast, so we're keeping an eye on it.
Yes, and so I don't think it would stop it because of rain, but here's when we run into problems, particularly at the Tampa airport, is when there's lightning. When there's lightning, the workers that load your luggage and unload your luggage, that direct flights, that make sure planes get where they need to go on the ground, they can't stand out there in the lightning. It's dangerous. And so they have to stop working when there's lightning within a certain vicinity of the airport. And so that would be the only problem that I might foresee next Thursday and Friday, not this Thursday and Friday, because this Thursday and Friday, you're not going to be able to find water even in a bottle at this point. We're not looking at any chances for rain. But next Thursday and next Friday, that's when we expect this surge of tropical moisture, which this could still change. We're very familiar with the fact that this is not a perfect science this far out, but we are identifying, what we can do this far out is identify broad patterns, and that allows us to help forecast this far out. And so this is one of the more broad patterns that we could have a little bit higher confidence in than an hour by hour rainfall forecast. So the only problem I foresee is if a lightning storm set up near the airport, it might delay things a bit.
Yeah, and hopefully for not that long. We saw that a couple days ago with a thunderstorm that kind of sat over the airport, and those flights had to fly around for a little bit. But luckily, things are usually pretty smooth sailing at Tampa International because we're used to those thunderstorms. But yeah, as you mentioned, Rebecca, we look for patterns, right? And we've been seeing somewhat of a pattern for the past couple of days, but it kind of comes and goes. So we're keeping an eye on it at this point. We don't have a lot of confidence in what it will be or how much rain we could see. So it's still a little too early to kind of answer those questions, but wanted to give you a heads up because I've certainly been seeing some of it on social media.
Yeah, and we talk about these rains, and Rebecca mentioned this as well. Harold coming into Texas. I mean, Texas desperately needed rain. And, I know that tropical storms, hurricanes, they get a bad rap for many, many reasons. I get that. But here in the Southeast, oftentimes they can be life-saving because, and I know that may sound crazy, how is that possible? Because of the rain that they actually bring. I mean, you could be in a drought situation and you get a decent tropical storm that's over you for a length of period of time, and you can just erase a drought fairly quickly. On the same vein for us here in Augusta, we're not worried about some of the things that y'all would be in Tampa, which would be storm surge. Obviously wind would be a factor for us, but not as much because we're not along the coast. Our biggest problem inland, especially here in Augusta, and you get into the Augusta, sort of what we call the Midlands, also South Carolina, is tornadoes. Yes. We have the biggest outbreak of tornadoes during tropical systems than any other time. Beyond cold fronts, beyond any other weather system, these tropical systems, once they move inland, spin these tornadoes up like this, and they can happen rapidly. So that's our biggest fear. Any city inland from the coast, when these storms move inland, is a tornado threat. But the rain, the beneficial rain that these bring is tremendous. And like you can see this map here, although you've got like sort of a bullseye of a 2 to 3 inch rainfall in a very short, area of Texas. But that was extremely helpful. And I mean, that's is a blessing to many when you're talking. If we could just get the rain without all of the ancillary wind damage and the other things that bring problems when you have these tropical systems run ashore.
Yeah, and you mentioned the tornadoes. There were numerous tornado warnings yesterday, even with how weak Harold was as it moved ashore. So that's always a threat we look for. I'm not sure how many of those warnings ended up verifying, but they certainly wanted the rain. Some of them got the rain. I know that 24-hour rainfall map only accounts for the past 24 hours. So that was as of 12:50 Eastern time yesterday afternoon. And of course, that rain did start pretty early on in the morning as those bands kind of moved on shore. So Corpus Christi, Brownsville, they definitely got some rain down there. There may have been a little bit of the storm surge, but I know that Austin really needed the rain. I think they got maybe one downpour that went through. But it did break their streak of 100-degree days. I think that they had been having 100-degree day streaks since early June, I believe. So that yesterday was the first day that they did not have the actual temperatures reach 100 degrees.
Yeah, they were thankful enough for that, right?
Yes, that in itself.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the things that I talk to people a lot about is that we got to remember, and I'm sure y'all have talked about this as well, when we talk about these systems, a small system can bring a lot of rain. You don't need this enormous hurricane to cause, to bring a lot of rain and a lot of damage. People need to remember, we also talk about categories. And one of the things I always stress is forget this category stuff, because the difference between a category 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 is 1 mile per hour wind speed, right? So that's why we got to drop the whole category thing. We got this as in being focused on that, right? And remember, there are other aspects that we got to really pay attention to with these storms, because again, a small storm can cause a lot of damage.
They sure can. Yeah, each storm is unique in itself, and they each bring different impacts with them. So we always try and focus on the impacts as opposed to the official cone, because the impacts are important and they do reach outside of that cone. We do have another featured comment coming in here to hashtag Hey Rebecca from Edwin on our WFLA page, hashtag Hey Rebecca. I'm watching from Texas. Any more chances of another tropical storm to head to Texas?
There's always a chance. Now, there's not anything imminent out there right now that would lead us to believe you're going to see anything like you just saw with Harold moving onshore. The fact that you have that heat dome, that big high pressure system sitting over northern Texas in particular, would tend to steer anything that does form around that high pressure, just like it's steering Harold a little bit further south. The forecast models earlier for Harold predicted that heat dome would be a little further north when Harold moved in, and that would possibly impact the Louisiana coastline with Harold, and certainly more of the Texas coastline than we saw instead of the Mexican coastline. And so when we take a look at the tropical moisture map, when we get that same surge in tropical moisture over the next couple of days, Texas does not. It's just barely on the edge there, and that's that heat dome keeping things quiet and dry. But the other good news, if you're looking for rain and looking for a tropical system to head towards Texas, you are in a zone where we typically see August development, which is right across the mid-Atlantic, then getting pushed into the Gulf or getting pushed up into the North Atlantic. The problem with this season is the areas in red there that's most likely for storms to form. That's where we're expecting the highest shear to set up because of the El Nino that's settling in. And so that's why we talked about the possibility of storms forming a little further north in this zone. And we're the possibility that this season we could see a lot of storms forming outside of our typical development areas because it's not the typical year, because we possibly have that wind shear that would counteract the ability for storms to form or at least thrive in those areas.
So, Tim, I have just a quick question for you. You know, I just want to know your thoughts kind of on the rest of the season. What are you going to be looking for? You talked a little bit earlier about how, you know, we had a jump start to the season. It's been a little quiet. But what are you going to be looking for as we go through the rest of, you know, the busiest part of hurricane season here?
Well, again, yeah, the peak of hurricane season is September 10th, right? And we're headed right towards it, no doubt. And the timing couldn't be better. We have all these storms that are popping. I think, again, the clear thing here is the wind shear. And I often, you know, we talk about wind shear. And for those to describe what wind shear is like, let's say outside you have this bush, right? This bush that has all these crazy, you know, stems from it, and it looks horrible. What you need to do is you need to shear it. Right. And that's exactly what wind shear is. Wind shear basically is the atmosphere shearing the atmosphere to make it all, you know, even, if you will. But it's really not even, because you have wind going at different directions and different speeds at different levels of the atmosphere. That puts really a hindrance on any type of storm development, because I often refer to hurricanes, tropical storms as an athlete. Right. Because the stronger they need the juice, they need that energy drink, which is warm water, right? So you have this convergence, basically down to the bottom, sucking in all this warm air. You have a warm core, which is from the bottom to the top is warm, right? And then and as this thing grows, it has no wind shear, or very, very little wind shear. The slightest bit of wind shear can obviously ruin a storm's growth, right? So it's an athlete that all of a sudden may look great, but then ends up having a Snickers bar at the end, and it's not really healthy for it. So then it fades out. So if we can keep the wind shear down, I think that's a big issue. I think we're pretty much the Saharan dust. I think is pretty much that's not really part of the big issue as it was earlier right now. So I think if we keep wind shear down, there's a great indication as such. A lot of that, you know, will still move off towards the west, but as of now, I mean, that doesn't seem to be that big of an issue. So if we can keep that wind shear down, I think we're going to start to see these storms grow, because the waters, like I said before, are just ripe for development. So it's that energy, that juice, that energy drink that these storms, these athletic hurricane storms need to be able to form. So I think that's the thing we need to keep a very close watch on. And again, one of the things that is people need to realize with this, and people I know get frustrated, because I hear a lot of this a lot. You all may hear this as well, is that, you know, 2 days ago you said nothing was going to form, and then all of a sudden something's formed. How is that possible? You know, well, I mean, again, you can get, you know, a cluster of thunderstorms. We see this off the African coast all the time. That's where we really have to start watching. We get into late August and September. These storms that come off the African coast, they're just regular run-of-the-mill thunderstorms, and they can then quickly turn into tropical systems, hurricanes, and so on and so forth, as they move from east to west, which generally is about a 9 to 10 day trek, wouldn't you all say, from the time it's off the coast of Africa by the time it could conceivably reach the U.S. coast. But these things can happen very, very quickly. And again, it could be one moment we're not seeing anything, the next moment these cluster storms then start to develop. And I think that's what we're going to have to watch.
Yeah, and we rely on our forecast models, a lot here because that's what we do every single day, right? And sometimes we're only as good as those and what they can predict. And if they don't show it, then if none of them are showing it, we have confidence that that's not going to happen. But sometimes, things do spin up quickly, and that's why we always say to be prepared, regardless of what happens this season, because storms can certainly spin up quickly, especially close to home. So we do like you to be prepared here on Tracking the Tropics. We love the analogies, Tim, because that's what we do here as well. We kind of break things down in an easy to understand format. And that's what we want you guys to know. We want you guys to know the science behind it. We want you to be prepared for anything that may form.
Absolutely.
Rebecca, you have any last thoughts on today's edition of Tracking the Tropics, what we're going to be watching for over the next few weeks?
And so I do think it's interesting because some months we're more predisposed to development closer to the coastline. And then we talked about this season because of the shear over the middle of the Atlantic that we expected and the warmer sea surface temperatures that we would each month this season be more likely to see storms develop right along the coastline. That's just what we saw with Harold. And as we're looking at the August development map, I am a little bit worried. I might be watching the Carolinas a little bit more closely because that is a more likely area for development this time of the year. So that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that until I just looked at this map.
Yeah, and so, a storm like Franklin, which is out there right now, just kind of meandering. Hopefully, we'll get one of these random mid-season, late season, early season fronts that come through and kind of kick that out to sea pretty quickly. But because it is going to meander really through the middle of next week, that's something that we'll certainly continue to keep a close eye on. And we will obviously keep a close eye on that tropical moisture moving in for next week. There's that track of Tropical Storm Franklin, which, again, meandering kind of northward through early to middle next week, strengthening as it does so, taking advantage of those Atlantic warm waters there. So, of course, we'll keep an eye on that one as we head into the middle of next week. Any last thoughts, Tim, as we wrap up today's episode?
Well, it's interesting about Franklin. Franklin, making, going through Hispaniola, and then you're talking about the Dominican Republic. That's a very mountainous area there. And a lot of times, storms that go through those mountain areas are just torn out by those mountains. I don't think that's going to happen with Franklin. Franklin may be a little weaker as it gets to the other side of those mountains, but once it does, as you can see here from this map, which I think is spot on, I think it will quickly gain strength again, Category 1 and Category 2. So the mountains really aren't going to have that big of an effect on Franklin's demise, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword there with the Dominican Republic, because we talk about the mountainous islands there, which are a good thing because it does help tear the storms apart, but it also helps to squeeze out a lot of tropical moisture and creates the possibility of those mudslides, which happen so frequently, even in the weakest of storms that cross over the island. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that as it moves off to the north. Luckily, it's going to now start to move up and pick up some speed as it crosses over the island. But we'll be thinking about that area, and we will be keeping an eye on all the tropics here on Tracking the Tropics. I think that's going to do it for today's episode. It was a busy one, another jammed-packed one with a lot of tropical activity going on. Of course, Harold and Hillary impacting the United States over the past couple of days. The rest of the storms that we are looking at right now, not going to do too much to the United States. But of course, we keep an eye on all things tropics here on Tracking the Tropics. Remember, you can watch all past episodes on trackingthetropics.tv. You can also listen to podcasts of the episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That includes today's episode in case you missed anything when we wrap up. So that'll do it for today. For Tim, thanks for joining us today.
Amanda, Rebecca, thank you so much. What a pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. And
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you again. We love to chat tropics here on Tracking the Tropics. So for Tim, Rebecca, and myself, we're going to wrap up today's episode. Hopefully we'll see you next week on Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern Time, or of course earlier if we need to let you know about anything that develops sooner. Take care, and thanks for watching.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms. And for storm updates, the latest models, and helpful resources, visit trackingthetropics.tv.